Welcome to Cut the Bull, an insightful podcast which addresses the news of the day and the cultural issues plaguing our society, bringing logic and context to these topics and discussing solutions too real for mainstream pundits. Now, here are your hosts, Charles Love, Shamika Michelle, and Wilfred Riley.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Bull. I am Charles Love, alongside my co-hosts, Shamika Michelle and Wilfred Riley. And our guest this week is Chris Ferguson, Stetson University professor of psychology, author of Catastrophe, How Psychology Explains Why Good People Make Bad Situations Worse, and Shamika's favorite guest. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on today. I appreciate being back.
Well, it's good to have you back, and I'm sure we'll have as much fun as we did the last time. We talked about that book. Some woman was soaking in blood, and Shamika was getting beauty tips, and now Catastrophe. You're talking about good people making bad situations worse, and I guess sometimes bad people are kind of middle of the road people making bad decisions. So, tell us what the goal of the book was. What were you trying to get people to understand about the catastrophe of human nature?
Yeah, I think the book was it initially started. I was thinking about doing something on COVID-19 actually, and talking about how people responded to that. But it turned out like about 101 other people already wrote books about COVID-19 within about 3 months of the pandemic breaking out. So that was already kind of captured. And I decided, well, let's take a broader look and think about, how we either as individuals respond to crises, or how we as a culture or cultures in general respond to crises, and try to figure out why we're so bad at it, for the most part, why we tend to make so many mistakes, and whether that's, fully trained airline pilots crashing perfectly good planes, or if we're talking about as a society trying to make a decision about how to fix some kind of problem, whether it's like an energy crisis or something else, why do we always tend to make really, really bad decisions? And it kind of comes down to there's a lot of ways that we're sort of programmed to think, probably through evolution and other kinds of issues that are going on, that sometimes get in the way, whether it's we're anxious, we're upset, or it's just a kind of a cognitive bias. And that maybe if we try to do a little bit of work to understand what these kinds of biases are, then that may help us get through some of those roadblocks and make better decisions in the future. And a lot of it, I'll be honest, will still say that it came from just observing how people I use debate in a very advisedly way, but sort of like converse or scream, really, I guess maybe is a better word, at each other when talking about, politics or any kind of crisis situation. You can name a whole bunch of different things, from abortion to climate change, all kinds of other stuff. And, just the general sense of, people tend to have the sense of like, I and my side are 100% right, and the other group are evil or stupid or something is wrong with them. And that made me think about like, wow, this is really, really fascinating. And psychology has kind of spoken to why we do these sorts of things over the decades of research. And yet, oftentimes psychologists are as bad as anybody else at repeating these types of problems. So I kind of wanted to lay it out and like kind of look at some different areas where, whether it's individuals making really bad decisions, even though they're smart people, or if it's, groups of individuals making really bad decisions, even though theoretically they're smart people, why do we keep doing this, and how can we learn from that and maybe make better decisions in the future?
Oh, Will's back. I was going to go to Will, then I was like, oh, Will's gone, so I can't. And now,
I'm here. I just turned off the monitor.
Oh, okay. So in the book, Chris uses a lot of very good examples. Like you mentioned the plane crash. He opened with the plane crash. And I mean, you had two really great but different examples, to talk about this, type of thing. One, like you say, the plane crash you described where, something went wrong and we kept going down the wrong lane and ignoring all the signals that were telling us, telling them to do something different. And they continued on that way. And then our good old buddy, Franz Ferdinand, the war to end all wars that didn't end all wars, over a guy that got killed and no one liked, and no one could seem to stop themselves. So those are two pretty stark examples. But then you go on throughout the book, talking about a lot of things, moving forward and talking about all the things we're dealing with today. So, Will, I want to give you a list of some of these things. So he went from hoarding toilet paper to climate change, irrational fear, race, mass shootings, fire, which was an interesting one, and immigration. So, Will, what do you want to say? Obviously, you're hiding though, but no, what do you think about those issues and how the types of things he's talking about, the way we approach the debate manifests itself in how we deal with those issues?
Well, I think this is interesting. I think Chris knows a lot more about this professionally as a psychologist than I do, but it's always been kind of a personal interest of mine. It even ties into my investing. Something I've noticed over the years is that, like, I don't take doomsday predictions seriously at all. Like, I'm not worried about climate change at all. I don't not think that the world is going to, what does the latest Danish paper say? In 125 years, the world's going to be 2.14 degrees warmer. Like, I have no doubt that's true. But I also have no doubt that in 124 now years, we're going to develop some improved seawall technology or something like that. The one thing that might stop that is what's called dysgenics, like us getting stupider. That's another thing that we're not talking about. The only thing could stop that technological improvement curve is something of equal import that affects actual human DNA. But there's this problem that you look at over the last 80 years of human existence with these stupid ass large scale predictions. And I mean, I could really go into these at the level of business or even the level of social science, like peak oil 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Y2K, although we at least had to do some work to stop that. Killer bees and the great northerly migration, the Western heterosexual AIDS epidemic. Even with COVID-19, Tom Pueo, a guy I like, who I've talked with online, but like the hammer and the dance. Remember, 15 million people were going to die from COVID. This guy was on CNN making these lunatic predictions. We needed to lock down for a year in his Brooks Brothers suit. This goes on and on and on. Global cooling was the thing before global warming. People say this was the front cover of Time. It wasn't, but it was page 2. I mean, so just why does this keep happening? It's a real question. The Club of Rome, the world was going to run out of resources. The ultimate one, and it amazes me every time I see this guy talking on television today, Paul Ehrlich's Population Bomb, which opens the struggle to feed the majority of humankind is over. And each chapter goes on to make these doomsday predictions that we're just still blamed for in the social sciences. Like in chapter 3, we lose India. It's just they're not going to be able to feed their population. So this idea that there are mass catastrophes coming, and we need to make this systemic change guided by the leadership clade to prevent it. This is something that we see over and over again. I mean, World War I is actually a fairly minor example of just these bad decisions being made to prevent catastrophe. But I mean, as opposed to me ranting, Chris, why do people keep what's the reason for large scale bad decision making? Why do people keep making these extremely poor predictions at very high levels that cause dumb shit to happen that's catastrophic?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question, and of course the answer is always like it's complicated, right? So the standard like response item, but no, I mean I think a couple things happen. Is one is you get like different actors that get involved in this some stuff, and so certain groups of people make these types of predictions because it suits them to do so. They benefit from or profit by getting attention. Politicians, can get more votes by activating, at least in their theory, activating voters behind them. It appeals to certain groups of donor class individuals who get motivated to shell out, campaign funds and things like that. So to some extent, people will make these kinds of large pronouncements because it gets them attention, to do so. So there's like this attention economy around that sort of thing, and I think on the other hand, there also is a certain amount of people that in good faith really do worry about, some of these catastrophes, down the line. And they think wrongly that by scaring the crap out of people, that will motivate them in some way to do something. So climate change is an excellent example of this. Like, I agree with you that, probably there is some climate change, probably humans are contributing it to some degree, but probably we'll figure out some way either to reverse it or deal with it, or it's not going to be an absolute, it's not the end of the, you see these pronouncements like we have 10 years left to avoid like the end of the earth, essentially. But the reality is, even if that were true, for instance, that is not going to motivate people. People are just going to say, well, we got 10 years left. I'm going to get a Corvette and just, burn all the gasoline I can, just driving around having fun for those 10 years. If this is done, for the most part. And, and I think a lot of these activist efforts, again, they may be acting in good faith. So it's not, my point that they're bad people necessarily, but they fundamentally misunderstand what, motivates people to change their behavior. So part of the thing with like climate change too, is like you're saying, like 125 years to me is pretty abstract, I mean, so, and then if you're going to argue that I need to change my behavior today for something that's going to happen 125 years from now, most people just aren't going to do it. I mean, as I say, you always hear people saying that we need to switch to eating a plant-based diet. And I tell people, like, if you're telling me I can't eat steaks to save the world, that the world's going to burn. I mean, that's just the reality of it. That's just, I'm open to other solutions like lab grown meat or something of that sort. But if you're just saying you had to be a vegan, no, that's just not going to happen. What are my other options? And giving people small things that they can do to, fix smaller problems tends to motivate people more than, say, gluing yourself to a road and stopping people from getting to the emergency room, or throwing mashed potatoes over a famous painting or something of that sort. So people just sometimes just don't seem to quite grasp, if you really do want to motivate people towards a goal, how do you do it? And actually singing Catastrophe tends to have a backfire effect, and either people give up, or, as you were saying, over time, if you keep doing this over and over again, I'm 52 years old, so I'm aware of all these different, pronouncements people have made. I remember them as a teenager in the 80s saying we were going to run out of gasoline like in 10 years. And here we are. Now we have too much gasoline, people are telling us, right? And if you keep making these doomsday pronouncements, all the time, eventually people just get tired of it. They recognize that, yeah, we've heard this song before. And you might, maybe this is the one, you're right about this one, but people have gotten so tired of hearing it over and over again that they're not going to listen now. That's the classic, the boy who cried wolf, type effect. But I think it's, to understand it, it's the people do these things. And this is going to sound cynical. Most people don't do good things because it benefits the people they're doing good things for, but they do good things because it benefits themselves. It either gives them status, or attention, or in some way makes them feel good about themselves. And if we understand that, then I think we can understand what motivates politicians or activists or other groups of people, psychology professors probably, to do the kinds of things they do that are not all that helpful.
Well,
wearing masks in 2023 fall under that?
I probably at this point, yeah. It is interesting. I mean, my observation, and you never know exactly, maybe someone you see is wearing a mask, maybe they have a medical condition that, so, I always try to be somewhat generous, but, my observation is the people that I tend to see with masks on in public, overwhelmingly seem to be young and pretty helpful, pretty healthy, looking individuals, usually with, multiple piercings or blue hair or that sort of stuff. So I'm not trying to be, again, mean or anything about it, but I think there again, a lot of that stuff now is this kind of social signaling, right? You're signaling that you're on the right side, if you will, for your particular group of individuals, and that's how we gain, status. I'm actually kind of fascinated by. I remember, like, mid 2020, for instance, when people were like, "You're killing grandma because you want a haircut," and all that kind of stuff. And how really like conservatives largely won this argument. We're all living the world that conservatives, argued for in 2020, although nobody admits it, for the most part. Everybody's, I don't know about, I mean, certainly in Florida, nobody wears masks, that I can see. Very, very few people. Yeah, I mean, I think, as I tell my students, if you kind of think of the basic default human condition as basically selfish, then a lot of what people do makes a whole hell of a lot more sense, and stuff. And that doesn't mean I don't think people are, capable of reaching true goodness. I'm optimistic a little bit, but I don't think that's the default state, and so if you, and this is a universal thing, right? If you understand, most people do what they do because it benefits themselves. I mean, I wrote a book because I hope people will learn from it and do good stuff, but mostly I'd like to get a Corvette at some point in the future. You know what I'm saying? So it would be great if the book like solves real problems, but if it doesn't solve real problems, but I get a convertible Corvette out of it, I'm okay with that as like the outcome.
Well,
and I think it's kind of like where most people basically are.
well, I listed some of these things, and you say that the behavior that leads to it is complicated, but it's kind of like common in human nature.
Yeah.
So it's a natural response, but I don't know if it's not any different than normal, and it just looks that way because of social media. But I have to ask the professional, those behaviors are normal, but are we doing them more? Are we doing more catastrophizing? Are we doing more, my side bias than normal? Are we doing more of all of these, internalizing or all these, typical responses to problems or what we think are concerns or fears and things of that nature? Are we doing it more than we used to, or does it just look like that because everybody's showing us what they're doing?
I think it's probably, I mean, communication efficiency is obviously the best it's ever been in history at this point, where you can communicate with people across the world instantaneously, and that was never a situation that we experienced, before. But the basic behaviors are fairly consistent. The tendency to catastrophize and whip people up into irrational behavior over real or unimagined crises that yeah, you kind of thinking back to history, how many tragedies have existed in history because people got whipped up in one sense or another. There was some kind of crisis, and then you had to do some sort of horrible thing in order to fix the crisis. And that's kind of what motivated people to some extent. So I think what we're seeing is people's thoughts are more obvious. Think of like Twitter, and so people are just like their inside voices are now outside. So we see a lot more of how people are thinking, and I think that's part of what sort of motivated me to write the book, because as I've said sometimes online myself, my own inside voice being outside, it's like, wow, people are a lot stupider than I thought they were like 10 years ago. And I really mean that. Like I've watched people with like PhDs, people I like, people I respect, just lose their minds in ways that I would not have imagined, and I think a lot of that is because it just is more visible.
Right.
I think probably these folks, were as prone to that, 20 years ago as they are today. But I also think there is this sort of, the way that like social status is achieved has changed, particularly in the last 10 years. Things have definitely gotten more polarized, for instance. So there's a lot more of the sense of you attain status by signaling allegiance to your group and, smashing the other group, whoever that may be, So I think some of that has increased, and it's tempting, of course, to always blame social media for all this kind of stuff. I think it probably plays some role in our political polarization, but I think the basic inclinations have always been there, and so I don't think this is a new human condition, if you will. It's just maybe put on steroids a little bit by the ease of communication. And again, it's not all social media. News media is also changed in the last 10 to 20 years, maybe a little bit longer. And so the sense of you gain status by being, as much of a bastard for your side as you can, as opposed to trying to be a consensus building, moderate or whatever. That has changed a little bit, I think, in the last 10 years, but not from. I in no way mean to portray like the 1980s as Whoville, by any means. That the tendency was always there. It's just sort of ramped up in the last decade or so. And maybe it'll go back down again, but history is cyclical, right? And maybe it'll get a little better, then it'll get worse, it'll get better, it'll get worse, and that's just kind of how things go. So I think new media does play some role in it, but I don't think it's the real distal causal explanation for why we're prone to this.
Well, you mentioned partisanship. I want to talk about that. Now, your book does a great job when you talk about these issues of saying this is what they do on the left, this is what they do on the right, that kind of deal. But I do think that, we've talked before, and everybody knows I have my issues with the censors in the middle. So, and you call them, I won't say left, liberal. So you did a really good job as a liberal to not, and you talk about the dangers of calling people out and saying the other side is evil and all that kind of stuff. But when I talk to, and I see the way liberals describe, and I could be wrong, and I'd love to hear Shamika and Will's take on this, describe conservative, they say the left does this and the right does this. I always read it and I'm like, and definitely when I see it on Twitter, it's like, do these liberals actually know conservatives? I get the feeling that they don't really know conservatives outside. So to be fair, I think, and I don't get it from you, but a lot of them, what I get is the only conservatives they know are on Twitter or politicians. So they only see everything they don't like. And I'll use a couple examples in the book because I saw it a couple times in you, but not as often as theirs is 100%. But so you'll say something like, the left, like you took the left to task on fire, on climate change, on, and even if you want to do climate change, what is their issue with nuclear, that kind of deal, and GMOs. And then you say the right, this, that, and race, to fairness, those were the ones you attacked the left on. But you'll say something, I'm trying to think of an example. Oh, one was like immigration. It's like the left, is just willing to have open borders with no kind of oversight or anything. And the right thinks illegals are all criminals, right? And they, they're xenophobes and they don't want this and that. And I'm like, who are these people on the right that think all the immigrants are criminals? Because I don't know these people.
Yeah.
Right. Or like, I'll give you one example. I want to see if Will or Shamika agree with me what I say about what the left thinks about conservatives, the way they frame them. So I don't know if most people on the left know this, but when you take out of all of the stuff you see on Twitter, all the loud noise, there is division and different views, a diversity of views within the GOP and conservative people. So there are conservatives who are for and against the death penalty, right? There are conservatives who are pro-choice and pro-life. I don't think there's any Democrats left that are pro-life. The last one I remember was, I know because I moved from Chicago, was Dan Lipinski, and the Democrats spent millions to get him out of office because he was the only man in Congress on the left that was still pro-life, I'm sorry. So now, granted, it's true that the majority of conservatives will tend to be pro-life, but not all of them. I mean, you have no diversity on that issue on the left. So Shamika, I'll go to you first. You're on mute. Do you agree with me, or do you think that, because definitely there are extremes on the left and right. Do you agree, one, that liberals don't know many conservatives or don't understand the nuances of what they believe? Or the other issue could be that there are extremes on both sides, but they're not comparing the extremes on the left to the extremes on the right. They're comparing the extremes on the right to the average on the left, right? So this is what your typical liberal believes, and this is what all the right, but it really would be extremes.
Yeah, and well, I do think that they know conservatives. Like, anybody I talk to, my family, my friends, they know that I lean right. The issue is they don't really focus on laws or policies. Mm-hmm. They focus more on personalities and, whether somebody likes them or not, and whether somebody's racist or, and so, like, I was just told today It's not that I dislike Trump. I dislike the fact that he fuels white supremacy, and that he gets the KKK excited, and he doesn't tell them that it's wrong, and he has the Proud Boys who are racist, and if his effect was like you, like if the effect that he had on people was like the effect he had on you, I would be okay with the right. But conservatives are not like you. And I'm thinking there are so many conservatives that are just like me. You're looking at what the media is telling you that it is the majority, and it's not the majority. Like, there are some white supremacists, but there are white supremacists who are also on the left. I talk to a lot of them. You can tell by the way, the things that they say to me on Twitter, that they have this idea that they're supreme. When they want to check me for my beliefs, I can't understand how a Black woman could even be, voting Republican. That's white supremacy right there to me, that you think your thought process is so superior to mine that there's no way this little Black girl could be thinking for herself and deciding on policies and issues. I must be a coon. I must be an Uncle Tom. I must be a white supremacist in blackface. That to me is, racist, or what they call microaggression, And so I do think they know some. It's just that they follow whatever the media is telling them about who the majority is and how the majority acts and what they think. Like, they think all conservatives are walking around with tiki torches.
Right. And don't forget, they talk slower to you, the racists on the left. They talk
yes,
slower
they
to you so
sure
you
do.
can
They
keep up.
sing.
I like when you say they sing. And Will, what are your thoughts of that?
I actually think kind of a lot about this. I think Shamika put a lot of this really well. And one of the things, by the way, that Shamika just said that I don't think we do enough is call out some of this stuff on the left as racist. So, I mean, like, the idea that you're talking at half speed to a Black person trying to explain their politics to them is wildly racist.
Or just
I mean,
helpful, Will. Maybe it's just helpful.
Yeah, maybe we're all dumb and we don't understand how to start businesses and all this. I mean, we need to
Use
be
the
given
internet.
money. I mean, I'm at least tempted to play along with the left-wing racism. Like, yeah, Samassa, write me a check for $5 million. I mean, some of it's at least well-intentioned,
Right.
I could potentially invest it, like whatever. But I mean, like, it's, of course, there's a lot of this stuff on the left, if we're being real, though, like post-traumatic slave syndrome is just a way of being a genetic hereditarian, but make it woke. Like, there's something deep in our blood. It's very hard to test for, but it gets generationally transmitted for 8 to 9 generations. It goes away if you breed with whites. And it's like, I know what you're talking about. I went to college. So, I mean, I think we do need to start discussing some of that stuff in the context of traditional racism, traditional hereditarianism. But I mean, like, in terms of the broad points you're making, I actually kind of agree with Chris that I think the left and the right are both pretty diverse. I mean, like, when you say there aren't any Democrats that are pro-life, I mean, that might be true in the Senate today. I don't even think that's true in the House. But I mean, among just Democrats, among like Hispanic or Italian Democratic voters, I mean, that's 35% of the voting base. So, I mean, I don't think
I mean politicians, not people. Though.
Yeah, well, that's a funny line. I mean, politicians, not humans. But I mean, like, just among Democrats, I think that the left and the right are both extremely diverse. And actually, the concentration in Washington, because people are voted in by these very partisan primaries that 18% of people vote in, that get you the AOCs and the MTGs, that's a real problem. That's one of the things, like, kind of my discipline is looking at right now, trying to work on. I mean, like, yeah, the politicians are extremely unrepresentative. That's an issue, But yeah, I mean, there are plenty of pro-life Democrats. I mean, I would say that the split in terms of being pro-life between like Italian American Democrats and Republicans is probably only like 10, 15, 18%. But I mean, One thing I will say overall is that in general, the left, because they're more censorious, they're more female, they have a less aggressive approach style. The left knows a lot less about the right than the right knows about the left. And you really notice that, like when you have conversations online, like people will confront me with just these default things like, well, you're a prude. Like I'm a guy from a large city that used to manage a nightclub. And I see Shamika laughing even more than me. And it's like, nah, son, like not really. Like you're gonna need to do something else there. Like that's not right.
Right.
You're a racist. Like, no, I'm interracial and I'm in an interracial relationship. Like, no, I'm not. It's just these default arguments. Like, I'm a sex positive businessman. Like, you're 0 for 2. Like, and by the way, most sex positive businessmen vote Republican. Like, almost all of them do. It's like pro athletes. So I think there's just a lack of understanding. Like, if you look at those polls that show what liberals do when they encounter aggressive, funny groups like soldiers or sex positive businessmen, it's just block them, like gone on all apps. Like, have you ever unfriended someone on social media? It's like, for the strong liberals group, it's like immediately after 15 minutes of argumentation, I do. So I think that because of that personality type, there's often a lack of understanding of what the right is doing. So you get the you're a prude, you get the you're a racist. Another one for black conservatives is you're a coon. You're just trying to impress the white man. And I mean, again, like, I live in the area I live in Kentucky is where the only 3 cities are: Frankfort, Lexington, Louisville. I live in an upper middle class black area. I teach at a black college. That's actually the last thing on my mind. It's just not something I ever think about. But it's the immediate default. And this is said to people like Clarence Thomas, who's a Supreme Court justice. So it's just that's not real. It actually doesn't concern any of the people you're debating against. But these go-tos are used because there's a lack of understanding of the opponent. And in contrast, if you listen to whatever you might think of as Twitter antics, but like someone like James Lindsay, Chris Rufo, like the troubleshooters on the right describe the left, like they're pretty on point. So I do think there's less understanding because there's perhaps a little more hegemony there, because there's a little less engagement there. There's less understanding of, I guess, the right on the left than of the left on the right. Both are pretty diverse. Another point, no one really brought this up, but I would say the old cliche is pretty much true. Like people on the right tend to think of the left as stupid, childlike, but whatever, you'd still date them. Right. They're okay.
They're not evil.
People on as long as they don't get too crazily into the feminist space, whatever. But I mean, people on the left very often do seem to think of people on the right as evil.
Yeah.
Like sort of, you guys are Nazis, murderers. And this is interesting in light of actual history. I mean, I would argue that the major left-wing philosophies, communism, Juche, socialism in actual practice, so on, have killed substantially more people than the worst philosophies on the right. I mean, it's an old cliche, but even the Germans were the National Socialists. So I don't think that there's much of a leg to stand on there, but those are the differences as I see them.
Well, one other thing that I was waiting for you, I thought you'd mention, is another one is that I find interesting is evangelical. So they say that they're all like, you're all these Christian nationalists. But the thing about that is interesting, just like, people move, like Chris and I were talking, he was talking about Collins' little cartoon he made where he's like, I'm still here, and it shifted. Well, the country was predominantly Judeo-Christian for years, and because the left tend to move away from it more and faster than the right, obviously it makes them look like they're these, religious extremists, but it's not like all of them. It's not like there are no Christians. It's not like the black Democrats aren't Christians in large percentages. So it's not like, go ahead.
That's a good point, though, Charles. I mean, that's another thing that you hear if you're involved in these debates. Like, oh, well, X is just due to God. Like, yeah, you are obviously you oppose gay people in this context because that's what your Bible says, your little book, right? I mean, I think like at least 2/3 of our core team here are not very religious, to put it mildly. So, I mean, again, it's like, I don't think you need to appeal to the Bible to say, well, no, I don't think you need bio-male drag queens dancing in front of small children. But that's another default argument that you have to get past before you can get into the real conversation of, okay, why is it important that, you know, the person reading to children be a drag queen. Right. So yeah, you're absolutely right. There are all these default set arguments. I'm sure we have some on the right too. But yeah, that's another one. Like, why are you bringing Christianity to this? And it's like, I'm not. I just think that dude might be a pervert. It looks like Shamika has a.
I want to go to Shamika, but I just want to make sure that I mentioned that I also meant the other way too. Will is right, but also that when you say that, they're acting like there are no Christians or Muslims or religious Jews on the left. Right, they exist too. So when you do that, you nullify all them. We say all Christians are crazy right wingers, and then the ones on the left. Well, what about us?
Well, I would say there are very few white Christians or religious Jews on the left. Like, I actually looked at this data today. I don't want to go into like this lengthy ramble, but like I can actually pull this up.
Right.
So this is PRRI. They're looking at how people. So this is an interesting report. It's the politics of gender pronouns in public education. And they're looking at how many people believe there are only two sexes. Just some real shit here. But anyway, basically, everyone believes there are only two sexes except non-religious Jews and atheists. But almost all of the white religious people are Republicans. Minority religious people are split. But Shamika is just patiently waiting through all this.
Shamika.
Here.
Oh, no, I just wanted everybody to make note that I do have a verse on Bryson Gray's song coming out tomorrow.
Right.
So
you should say today, because it will come out the same day this post. So today,
yes, dropping today. And of course, you know, Bryson is a Christian rapper.
Right.
So
Shamika had to call her gay friends.
You said what? Yeah, to all my gay friends.
Shamika had to call her gay friends and warn them.
Shamika's out here hate crimming people.
Right. It's called Reclaiming the Rainbow. So that's a little
Are you rhyming? Are you like on the mic?
Yeah.
Yes.
Can you rap?
We'll see today.
You tell me let me know when you hear it.
We know she sings, so
and your whole team is like, God, you're just not real. But so no, I'm looking forward to this. I'll listen to it.
Oh my God, Chris, that was a mouthful. We just stole the mic from you for like 12 minutes. Go.
Oh, it's all good. No, it's all fantastic. No, I agree with a lot of what you're saying. I mean, you know, so obviously I live and work in very left spaces, right? You know, I work at a university. I can tell you most people that work at the university are pretty much on the left. I know a couple people at the university who are Republicans. Mm-hmm. So it does happen.
How many babies have they eaten?
Yeah, well, I don't know. I don't see a lot of babies on campus. I'll say that.
See? Those two.
I'm suspicious, right? It's a correlation here. So we all know correlation equals causation.
Exactly. All the
time. So, but I think you're absolutely right. I mean, you know, so for most, you know, it's one of the things I actually am sort of concerned about for our students is like, if I am the, you know, psychology department's conservative, then the students are not getting access to conservatives. You know what I'm saying? You know, if it's up to me to make the right argument on stuff, then the students are really being deprived of you know, and sometimes I do try to make that argument, but you know, I'm not really well positioned for it. Right. So I do have this concern that our students are, you know, some of them are conservatives, but many of them have never met a conservative, as far as I know, and never really heard a good faith version of a conservative argument. And I think that really deprives a lot of them of understanding, you know, like I said, the catchphrase is actually, it's Jesse Singles' catchphrase. It's complicated, right? But, you know, the sense of like a lot of things are really, really complicated. You know, you take like, you know, the abortion debate, which we sort of briefly mentioned, and it's a complicated issue, you know, and, you know, there are fair arguments on both. I'm on both sides of this. I know everybody hates. There are fair arguments on both sides. You know, that doesn't mean that you can't, you know, decide that you think the evidence is better for one side or the other, but you know, it is amazing how, you know, and I'll say, I mean, you know, in my own household, I think, you know, historically, I was probably more liberal, my wife more conservative, which is probably the opposite of demographics, like in the nation. But I think over 20, we're just a week over 21 years of marriage. You know, we probably have both drifted, you know, towards somewhere in the middle, which is kind of like what couples do sometimes. But you know, my wife has been historically pro-life. I think I probably, again, I see both sides of it, and I think I I mean, the thing that sort of bothers me in that is the sense of on the left that the fact that you hear this argument about a woman's body, and I agree with a lot of that. But I always try to say, but there actually are two bodies, in this equation, and that's not to say that, there's not some sort of discussion about when a fetus becomes a human being or something like that. There's no real magic number of weeks or whatever, but just the fact that students never hear the arguments on the other side for why, because all they hear is that, conservatives want to take women's rights away from them and blah, 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 blah. I say, well, no, that's not really what, they're thinking. You may disagree with their, conservatives' rationale on this, but you have to understand it. Even if you want to argue against it, you have to understand it in order to be good at doing that. We actually had a conservative speaker. Some of you may or may not know him because he's famous on Twitter, but Zuby, who's, I believe he's American. He lives in the UK, I believe. Yeah, he's black, but he's conservative, and I think he's kind of most famous for like showing up in
for our theme song. No,
yeah. I think he's most known for like showing up at a woman's weightlifting thing and claiming to be a woman. And if you ever seen him, I mean, he's a big, young, good-looking black guy, very muscular. Doesn't look at all like a woman. So I think he now holds, or I don't know if it's official or not, but he sort of like has the women's weightlifting record in the UK now, or something like that. I don't know. But anyway, so he's conservative, and he came to campus, and he actually, seems like a nice guy, for the most part. And, he was talking about free speech, and, a number of our students protested, not the majority, maybe a couple dozen or so protested. And I think, in fairness, I was not there for the events, so this is hearsay. But what I understood from some of my students who attended the event is that there was, I think, kind of say, to what you're saying, there was this divide between what Zuby knew about things like Florida's parents' rights and education bill, the so-called don't say gay bill, versus what the students thought about it. So they would say like this bill says, you can't say gay in the classroom, and Zuby would say, well, can you show me where in the bill that says that you can't say gay, in the classroom? And it turns out, of course, it's not in the bill. That so. I think that's the kind of thing that I worry a little bit about with our students is because they're not getting that other side very often, and I do appreciate that our university brought him in, and we have a pretty good commitment to free speech at our university. It's not the case everywhere, unfortunately. Right. But I think our students need to hear actual conservatives make conservative arguments for them to understand it and get a more well-rounded view of the world, even if they persist in being liberal progressives or whatever else. And also, like you said, I think it helps to see that the people on the other side, if you will, are human beings who may be wrong, but they are acting in good faith, that they have their reasons for. And if all you ever hear is that these are like monsters that hate women or, whatever, hate gay people or whatever else, then you never really get the full picture of why some people believe the things that they do. I mean, there are some evil people in the world, right? But again, like I think most people are not necessarily in that category. People may be sort of selfish, but oftentimes they're trying to do things that they think are the right thing to do.
Right. And then I did find one that I was going to say, because Shamika mentioned masks earlier. So in the book, you were talking about COVID, in the part where you were talking about COVID, you talked about masks and mandates and masks and lockdowns.
Yeah.
And you were talking about the left did these things, and the right, you were like people who thought that masks and lockdowns were tyranny, right? And I was like, well, did they, or were they really talking about the mandates?
Yeah.
Right? So that's what I was thinking. I was like, most of the people, like some of them wore masks, some of them didn't wear masks. You're right. And you know what I actually thought about when I read that is, I don't know if people know this. I mean, Will probably just knows generally. He speaks a lot, but he's not in New York as often. So at the height of COVID, I was doing, these news and radio hits all around, like Salem and Fox and Newsmax and all this stuff. Now, I don't know what they were saying on air, but like you say, the narrative was the right is crazy, won't follow the science. They're anti-vaxxers and all this stuff, right? Do you know every one of them had a vaccine mandate?
Say that again?
They all had a vaccine mandate. Did you know that? Like you couldn't go to the Fox News studios.
Oh, okay, interesting.
You couldn't go. Yeah, I got invited to the Christmas party, and you need to show your vaccine card. Right. Yeah. So that's the thing. So it's like when I'm reading, it's like, yeah, I know the narrative is all the rights believe this, but it's not really true. How do you get the truth out? Now they can still be wrong, but the narrative is that the right believe this. I'm like, they didn't really believe that, right? You know, they were more or less saying you shouldn't mandate it. Will was going to say something.
There's actually that's actually really interesting. And so first of all, like all human leaders are basically amoral. Like, I mean, like reasonably honorable. You have a personal code, but you know there's no ultimate right or wrong, and you do things that are going to make you happy. This is like one of the most established things we know about human beings. So, like, I already knew that this on the left, like Gavin Newsom and all those people, probably pretty much thought their policy was good. They probably wouldn't have implemented it if they didn't kind of believe in it. But of course, they're going to party and get laid and go to the French Laundry. Like I already knew that. But I didn't know that that was true on the right too. So that's really funny. So like Murdoch Jr. and Hannity and so on probably thought their policy was mostly accurate and you didn't really need the mask and so on. But they still got the one too, just in case. That's funny. That gels with everything we know about human beings. That's not surprising at all. Interestingly, that's exactly what I did.
But that's not even
I
a big
thought
deal.
Most of that stuff was bullshit, but I got the first round of vaccinations. And interestingly, I am honest about kind of being an asshole. Like I went on Twitter and the whole time was pretty honest. I was like, I'm not going to do this again, but I'm vaccinated. I think the best thing to do is not worry too much, but get the first round of vaccination. And I've been fine. I had COVID once, got vaxxed once. So that's really hilarious. The one thing that makes this dishonorable would be people that did exactly what I did and what I'm sure Sean did and Charles, what you pretty much just said you did, what most people did, and then lied about it.
Yeah.
Like, oh, that poison shot. Wouldn't let that touch my body. And it's like, come on with the bullshit. Like you did the same thing that 99% of the upper middle class did. Like, okay, so that would be annoying. That would be very problematic.
Right. And I'm sure some of them did it. But what I want to say is not even about whether
they did. Like we heard them.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't really listen to it. I didn't even listen to it. But I'm saying it's not even about the vaccine or the mask. It's the fact, because what did I say? My pushback to Chris was, well, he said that the right said masks were tyranny. And I'm like, no, they really didn't like the mandate. They followed and enforced the mandate.
Yeah.
When they didn't have to. Right? You could have just said, well, my business, screw it. Nobody's going to, police isn't coming to check. But no, they were like, no, you can't come to this event unless you do XYZ. No, you can't come here and visit unless you do XYZ. So they were arguing against the mandate and they were mandating.
Yeah. Well, it's very common that the public stances people take are different from their private behavior. I mean, that's a pretty well established thing as well. I mean, you can see that on the left at the same point as Will was mentioning, that I think like Obama was a classic example, right? Where kind of the sense of we all need to like seclude and isolate, and and then he had a party for what was it, like hundreds of unmasked, I don't know, maybe a big bacchanalian, alcohol fused festival. So you definitely see the sense of, I mean, my favorite example is like porn, right? And that's a fairly bipartisan, issue where you get like the feminists on one side and perhaps the conservative Christians on the other side. They're all worried about porn. Porn's bad. Porn's going to rot our brains. Blah 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 blah. We all ought to ban it. And wouldn't be a problem. I mean, if you get like into a room of like 100 random Americans and say, how many do you think porn's a problem? And nearly 100 hands are going to go up. And if people really believe that, nobody would be consuming porn. I mean, the problem would fix itself, And so you definitely see the sense of, again, like what people say. And this is classic politician, sort of behavior. What people say in the public in order to sort of,
Can I ask you a question here, actually, quickly?
Absolutely.
What's your take on this? And sorry to all bust into you guys' questions, but I read some of the porn research recently after an argument with a feminist friend. And my opinion is that most of the porn takes from the feminist left and the evangelical right are complete hot garbage. Like their sex crimes seem to be declining despite higher rates of reporting. I think there are too many young guys sitting around jacking off all day. That's the one thing that I did pick up from this. But like the men don't want women anymore. Like it seems to just be complete bullshit. It's the same thing that they said about video gaming. It's the same thing they said about violent cinema with Terminator, drill rap. Like people like sex. The percentage of men that watch porn seems to be about 89%, women 55% or whatever.
Yeah.
I'm not a sex therapist, but it seems to me that masturbating and thinking about women would actually increase your T levels.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, I'm in a happy relationship. I don't watch porn a lot, but it seems to again just be like the feminists and the extreme Christian end saying nonsense because they think of sex itself as a bit degenerate. What's your take on this? Like, is porn a social evil?
No, not from. I mean, in terms of it having an actual like impact on people's health or behavior, whether it's an evil or not, of course, is a moral question. But in terms of like an empirical question, like, no, we don't really see evidence that like porn consumption is associated with sexual aggression. For instance, that's the area that I'm most involved in. With that. And as you said, I mean, as porn consumption has gone up, this is cross-national, rape and other sexual assault rates have gone down. Now that's correlational data. You can't say it's causal.
Course, yeah.
But the numbers are moving in the wrong direction for the causal argument, that's opposite. And that's always kind of like this whack-a-mole sort of effect with porn, right? That's like, well, okay, well, maybe it's not sexual aggression. Maybe it's causing erectile dysfunction, right? And then you could say, well, no, there's no evidence that suggests it causes erectile dysfunction, and people kind of move off onto saying, well, what about this? What about that? What is it causing? Blindness? Is it causing like?
Yeah, I saw that, and it was literally just like, this is what Coach Pencil used to tell us. Like, it's just bullshit.
They just went
like, if you sleep with your girlfriend and jack off, you're gonna go blind before state. Like, that was actually the one thing where I was just like, okay. Like, this is literally just like your Catholic girlfriend and your coach. Like, those two extremes saying no. Like, enough with this crap. And no, I don't think for any of the young men watching this, I don't think that having sex or watching pornography is going to make you go blind. Like, obviously regulate that. Ask a real woman on a date, but no, it's not going to do that.
No, Shamika.
I mean, I'm just saying.
You said, what about erectile dysfunction?
We want to make sure nobody's headed in that direction. It don't have to be.
Well, I think they'd have to be doing a lot of it.
One actual real point there in terms of what erectile dysfunction means, like for the fellas, like the average man over 25 can have like 2 to 3 orgasms a day. If you are watching porn all day, like there are guys that get too into gaming and pornography. Like if you masturbate 3 times a day, you're probably not going to satisfy your girlfriend that well. Yeah. So I mean, like there is a reality. It's not like porn is evil or gaming is the other one that I see the same people complaining about. Because
don't get Chris started. Yeah, I didn't have no time. I didn't want to get into that. I was like, oh,
yeah, no, I know Chris has written about this professionally. Yeah, but no, like this time they're imitating killing, not just sex. The little murdering monkeys, but like enough with the moral stuff, though. I'm not talking to you guys. I'm just saying in general to mankind. But no, I mean, I do think that the one thing I notice about this as an academic myself is that people do withdraw into virtual worlds. I mean, for a while, there was an actual game called Second Life. Yeah. That's the one effect that I do notice that is measurable. Like if you're watching pornography to the point where you do masturbate more than once a day, and you are gaming to the point where you're spending hours a day doing this, and you're on social media for a couple hours a day, that's kind of a vice of mine. Like that probably is affecting your relationship with your girl. Like that's not a moral issue by that point. That's just you're spending 6 hours a day doing this shit that's not real. Like if you're at the point where you have avatars, like your email and so on, there are things that are supposed to be you that are 100 pounds lighter. Like that may be a problem.
Well, I don't even think we need to follow up on that unless you really wanted to say something, Chris. No.
Yeah, well, I think that's true. I mean, I think the only caveat I would say that's probably true for lots of things, right? So I think there is this sort of
too
tendency.
much of anything, right?
Yeah. If you overdo anything, to some extent, so people talk a lot about the game addiction, porn addiction, social media addiction, but there are studies on overdoing, exercise, eating, actual sex, work. There even are research papers on dance addiction and fishing addiction, which really fascinates me as a concept, So, I mean, what you basically get is, people do overdo fun things. And part of it is because for a lot of people, the real world sucks, so there's that aspect of it too. And when we look at why do some people overdo certain things, or even are you can Google cat hoarder, right? You see some people overdo cats of all things.
I know one of those. Oh, no.
Yeah. So I mean, there are a wide range of things that people overdo, and mostly it's because they have mental health problems, right? They have some sort of pre-existing depression, anxiety, autism spectrum disorders, things like that are already going on for them, and I think it's always tempting for us. That's why even like earlier on, I said, well, I don't want to like blame social media for all like humanity's bad behavior and stuff. It's very, very tempting for us to say, because a lot of people think this, that like, politics would be great if only we could get rid of social media, right? Like all of a sudden the political polarization would go away. All this like calling each other Nazis or groomers or whatever it is that we're calling each other this week,
But technically, you couldn't call me a groomer or a Nazi if you couldn't find me.
Yeah,
so that would go away.
That is true. That is absolutely true. But I think we have this tendency. Again, I with my students, I try to help them understand. Like again, so like a lot of our natural inclinations are kind of bad. And understanding that can help us improve, right, and aspire to some level of goodness. But if we just simply shift the blame away onto what is video games or social media or porn or other, the radio, trains, whatever the hell new thing people have invented, this particular decade, then we're just sort of, that's lazy. That's just sort of shifting the blame onto other things when we really ought to be focusing in on, ourselves and why do we have these tendencies to do some of these things that, either are disadvantage to others or are disadvantageous to ourselves. And that's really
and most of those things, it's not really the thing. It sounds like when you talk about porn, sex, working out, all that stuff, when it becomes a problem, it's because there's a finite amount of time. And if you spend too much time doing anything, it takes away from the other things you're doing, right? Yeah. You spend 7 hours a day doing something plus your job, you don't have time for the relationship or all the other things.
Yeah. Well, I mean, some of us kind of natural. I mean, I even like, so I'm on summer break now, which means that, other than working on some research stuff, I'm not teaching I'm teaching an online class, but that's fairly easy, so I'm not like going and meeting with students in person, that kind of stuff, and I kind of like semi joke with my wife, like, man, this is pretty good. Like, I don't want to go back. This is just a lot. I spend a lot of time, going to the pool, playing video games, hanging out with my wife and my kid. This is why I became an academic, right? Is to do this. And part of that, and actually, I like teaching. I like my job, but I think if you're like a coal miner, like or like an iron worker, right? Where your job really does suck. Which is probably the reality for the majority of people that. It requires you to be able to balance like the things like video games or social media are fun. My job is not, whether it's pushing papers around a desk or fishing for tuna or whatever the hell people are doing. And you have to be able to say, well, I'm going to stop doing the fun thing and go back to this, kind of shitty job that I have to do. And most people can do it because they realize they need to feed themselves and their family and that sort of stuff. But there are a certain segment of people that just can't, they just can't switch off from that fun activity, realizing that what they're going to switch to is something kind of awful to some one degree or another. And whether it's school for some kids, because school sucked for a lot of us, or it's their job and their job is not rewarding or it's actually punishing to some extent. Some people really, really struggle with that. So it's not so much that the technology is like taking normal people and causing them to have mental health problems. It's that people that already have certain types of mental health problems just can't switch off of the fun thing. And it's like I see parents say, like, why does my kid want to play video games all day instead of do their homework? Like, do you remember being a kid? I mean, what did you like homework? I mean, nobody other than the biggest nerds liked homework, or they'll say like, I wish my kid would go outside and look at trees. I've heard that one, like literally, like, when did you ever go outside and look at trees when you were 14? I didn't. Trees were boring. Now I'm 52. We're the same age, me and the trees, so now they're like years, now we get along a lot better, so it's a different.
Chris, I want to ask you one last thing. I know we're getting close to the end. I got to ask you one last thing. I talked about earlier how even though you consider yourself more liberal, more on the left, that you come off as more like a very centrist, more what I would describe as a conservative. Very it didn't seem like it was more liberal, and you took these topics and you were really down the middle on most of them. There was one, there was one, and you know what it is. I thought it was going to come up when Shamika alluded to it earlier, that you did join the others, and that is the T word, Trump.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Well, Trump was racist. Trump was authoritarian. What else was he? Trump was so. Let's just deal with the racism. Why was it that Trump? Trump. A lot of times Trump came off as racist. Why wasn't it? My opinion is why wasn't it Trump is racist and they voted for this clearly racist and Trump. Why does it have to be so racist? Especially since you being the researcher down the middle guy, that the minority people voted for him more in 2020 than in 16. Yeah. So do they not realize he's racist? It's always the white folks telling me how racist he is. That should have been Shamika, not me, because Shamika's the Trump fan, not me. But going, I'm sorry.
Okay, yeah, all good. No, I think a lot of it was that
she said not a fan,
a supporter.
She disagreed with that. Yeah, I think Trump's both his appeal and what turned others off to him was he kind of comes across to me. And I am interested, in the psychology of both gentlemen, that meaning Trump and Biden. And I think they both have significant flaws, to be honest. And I mentioned some stuff about Biden in the book too. But I think he probably has dementia.
But you didn't call him a racist, though.
What's that? Oh, well, but Biden has said some stuff too, right?
You didn't call him a racist. You called Trump a racist. That's my point.
Well, I think
you ain't black is not racist, but What did he say?
I think his famous quote, of course, was, and I think a lot of it for him is that he just says things, right? And he comes across as not having this frontal lobe that stops words from entering, So I don't know that I think he's a racist in the David Duke sense, but I think he had a tendency to just kind of say whatever thought came into his brain. And the one that I can say that got people on the left automatically into the mode of thinking that he was a racist is I think it was 2015. I think it was basically his announcement speech, right, when he kind of came out and said, there's this and I don't remember the quote, so I'm going to mangle.
They don't send their best. They're not sending their best.
The rapists and the criminals. So I think it was stuff I think it was this, somebody could say I think it was also the shithole countries comment and that kind of stuff. And you kind of say, well, if you look at those countries, I wouldn't want to move there. So there are probably ways of, and then of course, there are good people on both sides. Now, in fairness, I do think the left had their claws out ready to dig into anything, and interpret it in the worst possible light. So I've certainly seen, so I have myself had that meme of the, both sides, good people on both sides thing thrown back in my face by people on the left. So in fair, I certainly think people, over respond to some of these things, but he doesn't have that, he seems to not have that filter. Sort of I don't know if you saw it, there was just John Hopkins, just yesterday came out with some guideline where they referred to women as non-men.
Yes.
And it's this kind of a similar thing. It's just I can't believe that there wasn't a committee of people that no one person looked at that and said whatever our intent is, somebody's going to obviously be this is a self-inflicted wound. You know what I mean? This is an unforced mistake, here. So do I think that Trump is necessarily racist in the way that literally the KKK is a racist? No, I think Trump is out for Trump. I don't think he particularly cares about, I'll be honest with you, I don't think he particularly cares about poor whites, poor blacks, or anybody else.
That's a little more fair than right. But I'm sorry, Will. I gotta follow up, Will. I'm sorry. But one last thing then. If that is the case, I guess that brings me to the issue that the concern I have, not really an issue with them, but concern I have with the centrist view is that if we allow people to paint not just Trump, but the right, the conservatives, which is kind of what your book is about, don't paint people with these broad brushes, but it happens. But then you rail against these things that are truly bad, the everybody's racist and all that kind of stuff. But where do we go from here in solving those problems? We've already baked into the cake the fact that anybody who pushes back against those things are evil, bad, Nazis, racists, whatever. So they should be discounted. So now we, the centrists, realize those things are bad. So we're pushing back against, non-men. We're pushing back against giving young kids, teaching them to be transgender, giving them drugs, all that stuff. We're pushing back against the Kindys of the world. But no one's going to listen because the other people who were loudly pushing back against it have been painted as Nazis. So where do we go?
Yeah, well, it's tricky. I mean, a lot of this comes down to incentive structures, and part of what's been happening over the last decade, I think, Yeah, and a lot of this has happened on the left, and I think you're right. I probably criticize at this point the left more than I do the right, but and part of that is because of my disappointment and then kind of watching how the left has evolved over the last decade and such.
Mhm.
And a lot of it is this sense. I mean, I can tell you, on academic campuses, on the left, the person who's the most upset and the most offended wins the argument. The person this is different from 10 years ago. 10 years ago, someone started like bawling their eyes out and calling you a Nazi and a fascist. We quietly escort that person, to maybe refer them to mental health services or something like that. We could be kind to them, but we didn't think they won. And now there is this sense that they have that is a power move to some extent. Everybody gets afraid. The second oh my God,
and then more people do it.
Yeah, more, and it's exactly it. You incentivize that, and more people are going to, if you reward a behavior, you get more of the behavior. That's fairly straightforward, So if you want less of that, then we have to figure out ways of, disincentivizing some of the. And I think we're starting to see some of that in academia, not enough maybe, but I've seen some positive moves where some universities have refused to mandate DEI statements or trigger warnings or this kind of stuff. So. It's maybe not happening as much as it should, but it seems to be moving a bit more in that direction. That's maybe a bit more optimistic, but that's exactly what we need to do is like the person who says like, this is the cliche on Twitter, like I'm literally shaking, right? Is the kind of stuff that people will, really? I mean, shouldn't you take like 10 minutes then and like, come back before you type out shoot off a tweet or something of that sort, I don't think you are literally shaking, to be honest with you.
Right. So what? Can somebody say that? And if you are, so what?
Yeah, it doesn't make it you're right. Yeah, exactly. And I think we need to be like upfront. I think sometimes on Twitter I am maybe that guy. He's like, no, I don't think you are literally like shaking this very moment. But I think we need to get better at. I think we've gotten so sensitive that like whenever anybody seems the least bit traumatized, or upset, or whatever, we defer to them. Like that's royalty almost. And sometimes we need to just get better at saying like, look, if you're that upset, maybe you should see a therapist, right. But it doesn't mean you win the argument necessarily.
Right. In fact, you lose. Any last statements, Shanika or Will?
Well, I would like to ask Chris if he can see the difference in my skin. Do I look younger?
You definitely look younger, and and absolutely, yeah. That the Elizabeth Bathory skincare approach is definitely doing wonders for you.
Thank you so much.
Will?
I think that's a good note to end on.
There you go. Shamika's younger because of Chris. Well, he is Chris Ferguson, a Stetson University professor and author of Catastrophe, How Psychology Explains Why Good People Make Bad Situations Worse. Chris, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on tonight. It's always a lot of fun. Appreciate it.
I'm saving the day from you commies who lame, no, you can't fuck with me. I got a country to save. God bless the US of A. Land of the free and a home of the brave. God get all of the praise. I got a country to save, cause I'm Patriot J and I'm saving the day.